The soft glow of crystal chandeliers bathed the interior of Elevate, Boston's most exclusive restaurant, in golden light. Every detail, from the hand-painted murals depicting the city's skyline to the immaculate white tablecloths, spoke of wealth and privilege. This was where the city's elite came to be seen, to conduct business, to celebrate milestones. And tonight, it was where Blake Richardson had chosen to bring his girlfriend, Vanessa Carter. Blake adjusted his custom-tailored Armani suit and smiled at Vanessa, who was elegantly dressed in a midnight blue designer gown that complemented her blonde hair. At 36, Blake was at the pinnacle of his career as one of Boston's most successful real estate developers. He had everything: a penthouse overlooking the harbor, a collection of luxury cars, and a beautiful woman by his side. Life had become a series of carefully curated moments that reinforced his identity as a man who commanded respect and admiration. "To us," Blake said, raising his champagne glass. The bubbles caught the light as they danced to the surface. "And to the Hamilton project. As of this morning, the deal is officially closed." His voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything that mattered. Vanessa's smile was practiced perfection. "Congratulations, darling. I knew they'd eventually see things your way." As Blake basked in the warmth of his achievement, his gaze drifted around the restaurant, acknowledging the subtle nods of recognition from Boston's business elite. But suddenly his eyes fixed on a point across the room, and the glass in his hand froze midway to his lips. There, behind the bar, stood a woman with dark, wavy hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. Her features were unmistakable, though her face looked thinner than he remembered. The crisp black uniform she wore couldn't hide her exhaustion or the unmistakable swell of her abdomen. Sarah, his ex-wife, pregnant. The shock sent a tremor through his hand, causing champagne to spill onto the pristine tablecloth. The golden liquid spread like a stain across the white fabric, mirroring the sudden unraveling of his perfect evening. "Blake, what's wrong?" Vanessa's voice seemed to come from somewhere far away. But Blake couldn't tear his eyes away from Sarah. During their 5-year marriage, she had desperately wanted children. He had always refused, citing his building career and their freedom as reasons to wait. When she had suffered a miscarriage 3 years ago, a pregnancy she hadn't even told him about until it was lost, he had been in New York closing a deal. He hadn't come home immediately. That had been the beginning of the end. Now she stood across the room, carrying what could only be another man's child. The realization felt like a physical blow. "Excuse me," he murmured to Vanessa, rising from his chair with mechanical precision. His legs carried him across the restaurant floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet he couldn't stop himself. He needed to know, needed to understand. Sarah looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to frozen recognition. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the cacophony of the restaurant fading to background noise. "Sarah," he finally managed, his voice barely audible. She didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, one hand unconsciously moving to rest on her belly. "Blake," she acknowledged, her voice deliberately neutral. "What can I get for you?" The formality stung worse than outright hostility would have. Blake struggled to find words. I didn't know you were pregnant," Sarah finished for him, her eyes hard. "Working here, back in Boston. Which part surprises you most?" Before he could answer, another bartender approached. "Everything okay, Sarah?" Sarah never broke eye contact with Blake. "Everything's fine, Tom. Mr. Richardson was just returning to his table." The dismissal was unmistakable, but Blake stood his ground. "We need to talk." "No," Sarah replied, her voice flat. "We really don't. You lost the right to ask me anything when you made it clear I wasn't a priority. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have customers waiting." She turned away, effectively ending the conversation. Blake stood there, paralyzed by the collision of his past and present. When he finally returned to his table, Vanessa's face was a mask of controlled curiosity. "Who was that?" she asked, her tone deceptively light. "No one," Blake replied automatically, then corrected himself. An old acquaintance. Vanessa's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched. An old acquaintance who turned you white as a ghost? Please, Blake, I wasn't born yesterday. The remainder of dinner passed in a blur. Blake couldn't focus on Vanessa's chatter about the upcoming charity gala or her plans to redecorate his penthouse. His mind kept returning to Sarah, to her pregnant belly, to the dark circles under her eyes, to the life she was apparently living that was so completely removed from the one they had shared. That night, after dropping off a silently fuming Vanessa at her apartment with promises to call her tomorrow, Blake found himself parked outside his best friend and attorney's brownstone in Beacon Hill. Michael Foster answered the door in sweatpants and a Harvard Law t-shirt, a glass of scotch in hand. His eyebrows rose at the sight of Blake standing on his doorstep. Problem with the Hamilton. Deal? He asked, stepping aside to let Blake in. No, Blake replied, heading straight for Michael's liquor cabinet. He poured himself a generous measure of scotch before finally meeting his friend's concerned gaze. I saw Sarah tonight. Michael's expression instantly changed. Sarah, where? Bartending at Elevate, and she's pregnant, Michael. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Michael studied his friend's face. And you want to know if the baby is yours? It wasn't a question. Blake took a large swallow of scotch, welcoming the burn. We've been divorced for over a year. Legally, even if it is mine. You don't have any obligations, Michael finished for him, unless she comes after you for support, which, knowing Sarah, she won't. Blake sank into Michael's leather sofa. I need to know what's going on with her, where she's been, who she's with. Michael looked uncomfortable. Blake, are you sure that's a good idea? You guys had a clean break. She didn't even take alimony. Just find out, Blake insisted. Use whatever resources you need. 3 days later, Blake sat in his office overlooking the Boston Harbor, a manila folder open on his desk. Michael's investigator had been thorough. Sarah was living in a small apartment in Dorchester, far from the luxury townhouse they had once shared. She was working double shifts at Elevate, apparently saving every penny. Most notably, there was no evidence of a partner or boyfriend, no one who could be the father of her child. Unless... Blake checked the dates again. Sarah was approximately 6 months pregnant, according to the investigator's report. Their divorce had been finalized 14 months ago, but they had separated several months before that. The timeline was tight, but possible. The realization set his heart pounding. If the child was his, why hadn't she told him? And what was he going to do about it now? Meanwhile, across town, Sarah carefully lowered herself onto a chair in the small break room at Elevate. Her feet ached from the long shift, and the baby was particularly active today, kicking persistently at her ribs. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of weakness. You okay? Asked Lily Matthews, her co-worker, and the closest thing she had to a friend in Boston. Sarah managed a tired smile. Just the usual. Someone should tell this little one that Mommy's ribs aren't a soccer ball. Lily handed her a cup of herbal tea. So are we going to talk about the other night when your ex came in? Sarah's smile faded. There's nothing to talk about. Sarah, Lily said gently. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, and he's been back twice since then, asking for you when you weren't on shift. Sarah's head snapped up. He what? Lily nodded. He's not going to give up easily, you know. Men like Blake Richardson are used to getting what they want. Sarah placed a protective hand over her belly. Well, he can't have this, not after everything. Is it his? Lily asked quietly. Sarah didn't answer immediately. The question hung in the air between them. Finally, she whispered, Yes, but that changes nothing. Blake found himself once again standing outside Elevate, his breath forming small clouds in the chilly Boston evening. This would be his 4th visit in 2 weeks. Each time, he'd been told Sarah wasn't working or watched as she deliberately avoided his section of the bar. But tonight, Michael had confirmed she was scheduled for the evening shift, and Blake was determined not to leave without answers. He adjusted his tie and stepped inside, ignoring the hostess's attempt to escort him to a table. Instead, he made his way directly to the bar where Sarah was mixing a cocktail, her movements precise despite her growing belly. "We need to talk," he said quietly when she glanced up. Sarah's expression hardened. "I'm working, Blake. I'll wait until your shift ends. I finish at midnight. I'll be here." She looked as though she wanted to argue, but was interrupted by a customer requesting another drink. Blake retreated to a corner table with a clear view of the bar, ordered a single malt scotch, and settled in for the wait. At 5 minutes past midnight, Sarah emerged from the employee entrance, wrapped in a coat that strained to close over her pregnant belly. She stopped short when she spotted Blake leaning against his Aston Martin. "You're still here," she stated, her breath visible in the cold night air. "I said I would be." He stepped toward her, careful to maintain some distance. "Can I drive you home?" "No." "Sarah, it's freezing and it's late. Let me give you a ride." She crossed her arms protectively over her stomach. "What do you want, Blake?" "Is it mine?" The question hung between them, crystallized in the cold air. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her eyes, once so warm when they looked at him, now regarded him with wary calculation. "Yes," she finally said, her voice barely audible, "but that changes nothing." The confirmation, even though he'd suspected it, hit Blake like a physical blow. He had a child. He was going to be a father. Emotions he couldn't name surged through him: fear, guilt, anger, and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. "It changes everything," he countered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "When should I have told you, Blake? When you missed our anniversary to close a deal, when I lost our first baby and you didn't bother to come home for 3 days. Or maybe when you told me, and I quote, 'Children would just complicate our lives.'" Each accusation landed like a punch. Blake flinched, but held his ground. "That was before. Things are different now." "Yes, they are," Sarah agreed, her voice hardening. "I'm different. I don't need you anymore, Blake. I don't want your money or your conditional affection. This baby and I will be just fine on our own." A taxi pulled up to the curb, summoned by the restaurant's doorman. Sarah moved toward it, but Blake gently caught her arm. "At least let me help," he pleaded. "Financially, if nothing else. You shouldn't be on your feet all day in your condition." Sarah pulled her arm free. "I've managed this far without your help. I'll continue to do so." As she climbed into the taxi, Blake called after her, "This isn't over, Sarah." She looked back at him through the taxi window, her expression impossible to read in the darkness. Then the car pulled away, leaving Blake alone with a truth that had fundamentally altered his reality. The next morning, Blake sat in his office, staring unseeing at the Boston skyline. His assistant had already rescheduled 2 meetings after finding him in the same position an hour earlier. He couldn't focus on work, not when his mind was filled with images of Sarah. Sarah struggling to make ends meet, Sarah working long hours, while carrying his child, Sarah facing childbirth alone. A knock at his door finally broke his reverie. Vanessa waltzed in without waiting for a response, dressed impeccably in a designer suit that probably cost more than Sarah earned in a month. "You've been avoiding my calls," she accused, dropping into the chair across from his desk. Blake blinked, struggling to refocus. "I've been busy." "Too busy to return your girlfriend's calls for 3 days?" Vanessa's perfectly manicured nails tapped against his desk. "This is about her, isn't it? That bartender from Elevate." Blake stiffened. "What are you talking about? Please, Blake, give me some credit." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "I did some digging. Sarah Richardson, formerly Sarah Collins, your ex-wife, working as a bartender and, oh yes, pregnant." She leaned forward. "Is it yours?" The directness of the question caught Blake off guard. "That's none of your business. None of my—" Vanessa cut herself off, visibly gathering her composure. When she spoke again, her voice was dangerously calm. "We've been together for 8 months. You introduced me to your parents. We've discussed moving in together. And suddenly you're obsessed with your pregnant ex-wife, but it's none of my business?" Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Vanessa. Then uncomplicate it, she snapped. Is the baby yours? After a long moment, Blake nodded. Yes. Vanessa's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her shock. I see. And what do you intend to do about it? I don't know yet. Vanessa stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced precision. Well, let me know when you figure it out. In the meantime, don't call me. She walked to the door, then paused. One piece of advice, Blake. If she's suddenly appeared in your life with a convenient pregnancy, ask yourself why. Women like that... Don't, Blake interrupted, his voice odd. Don't finish that sentence. Vanessa's perfectly painted lips curved into a cold smile. As you wish. But remember, she left your world once before. What makes you think she could ever truly belong in it? After Vanessa left, Blake remained at his desk, her words echoing in his mind. Was there truth to what she'd implied? Was Sarah using the pregnancy to extract something from him? But even as the questions formed, he dismissed them. That wasn't Sarah. She had walked away from their divorce settlement with nothing but what she'd brought into the marriage, refusing even the alimony she was entitled to. No, if anything, Sarah was determined to keep him out of her life, not pull him back. Thin-stooled later that evening, Vanessa sat alone in her apartment, nursing a glass of white wine. Her conversation with Blake had not gone as planned. She had expected him to choose her, to reassure her that whatever had happened with his ex-wife was firmly in the past. Instead, he had all but admitted that he was still emotionally entangled with Sarah. Vanessa set down her wine glass with deliberate care. She hadn't clawed her way into Boston's elite social circles by backing down from challenges, and she certainly wasn't going to lose Blake to a pregnant bartender with nothing to offer but complications. The next day, she walked into Elevate during the quieter afternoon hours. She spotted Sarah behind the bar, looking tired but composed, as she sliced lemons for the evening rush. Vanessa slid onto a bar stool directly in front of her. "Hello, Sarah." Sarah looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Can I get you something?" "I think you know who I am," Vanessa replied, ignoring the question. Sarah placed the knife down carefully. "Yes. And I think you know I'm not interested in whatever this is." "This," Vanessa said, gesturing between them, "is me making something very clear. Blake belongs in my world, a world of influence, connections, and power. A world where you tried and failed to fit in." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly. "If you think Blake belongs to anyone, you don't know him at all." Vanessa leaned forward. "Let me be blunt, I know you're claiming the baby is his. Very convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Just as he's about to close the biggest deal of his career." "I'm not claiming anything," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the flush rising in her cheeks. "And I don't want anything from Blake. Not his money, not his time, and certainly not his sense of obligation." "Then why are you still in Boston?" Vanessa challenged. "If you truly wanted nothing from him, you'd be anywhere else." The question seemed to catch Sarah off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Vanessa pressed her advantage. "He feels guilty, you know, that's all this is. And guilt is a poor foundation for any relationship, wouldn't you agree?" She stood, dropping a 20 on the bar. "For the record, I don't believe for a second that the baby is his. But even if it is, don't mistake his sense of duty for something more meaningful." As Vanessa walked away, Sarah gripped the edge of the bar to steady herself. The confrontation had left her shaken, not because of Vanessa's threats, but because of the seed of doubt she had planted. Was she unconsciously using this pregnancy to pull Blake back into her life? Had she stayed in Boston, despite the painful memories, because some part of her wanted him to know? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp pain that radiated across her abdomen. She gasped, clutching her belly as a second spasm hit. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Tom," she called to her co-worker, her voice tight with fear. "I need help." Across town, Blake sat in Michael's office discussing the legal implications of his situation. "I want to set up a trust for the baby," he explained. "Something substantial, enough to ensure they'll never want for anything." Michael nodded, making notes. "We can do that. But have you considered what role you want to play in the child's life? Financial support is one thing, but Blake's phone rang, interrupting Michael's question. He didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway. "Is this Blake Richardson?" a female voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Lily Matthews. I work with Sarah Collins at Elevate. She's been taken to Massachusetts General Hospital. There's a problem with the pregnancy." Blake felt the blood drain from his face. "What kind of problem?" "I don't know the details, but she was in pain, and there was blood. She asked me not to call you, but I thought you should know." Blake was already on his feet, grabbing his coat. "I'm on my way." The antiseptic smell of the hospital assaulted Blake's senses as he rushed through the sliding doors of the emergency department. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat carrying a silent prayer that Sarah and their baby would be all right. He hadn't prayed since he was a child, but now words formed in his mind, desperate pleas to a God he'd long ignored. "I'm looking for Sarah Collins," he told the nurse at the reception desk, trying to keep his voice steady. "She was brought in with pregnancy complications." The nurse checked her computer. "Are you family?" "I'm the baby's father," Blake said, the word strange yet right on his tongue. After consulting her screen again, the nurse directed him to the third floor. "Maternity ward, room 312. The doctor should be there shortly." The elevator ride felt interminable. Blake's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. He remembered Sarah's first pregnancy, the one that had ended in miscarriage while he'd been in New York closing what he'd thought at the time was the most important deal of his life. He'd been so wrong, so catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. When he finally reached room 312, he hesitated outside the door. What right did he have to be here? Would his presence only cause Sarah more distress? But the possibility that she might need him, that their child might need him, overrode his doubts. He knocked softly and pushed the door open. Sarah lay on the bed, her face pale and drawn. An IV dripped clear fluid into her arm, and monitors beeped steadily beside her. She turned at the sound of his entrance, her eyes widening with surprise. "Blake? What are you doing here?" "Lily called me," he admitted, stepping into the room but maintaining his distance. "She thought I should know. What happened? Are you okay? Is the baby—" "The baby's fine," Sarah interrupted, some color returning to her cheeks. "They think it was Braxton Hicks contractions, combined with dehydration and exhaustion. They're keeping me overnight for observation, but we should both be okay." The relief that flooded through Blake was so intense, it nearly brought him to his knees. He steadied himself against the wall, breathing deeply. "You didn't have to come," Sarah said softly. "I told Lily not to call you." "I'm glad she did." Blake finally approached the bed, his eyes drawn to the fetal monitor that tracked their child's heartbeat. The steady rhythm was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the chair beside her bed. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. As Blake sat down, the door opened again, and a doctor entered, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of quiet competence. "Ms. Collins, how are you feeling now?" she asked, checking the monitors. "Better," Sarah replied. "The pain has subsided." The doctor nodded approvingly. "Your blood work looks good and the baby's vitals are strong. This was a warning sign, though. Your body is telling you to slow down." She glanced at Blake. "And you are?" "Blake Richardson," he answered, uncertain how to define his relationship to Sarah. "I'm the baby's father." The doctor's expression revealed nothing. "Well, Mr. Richardson, your baby is doing well, but Ms. Collins needs rest, complete rest. No more double shifts, no more standing for hours at a time. At this stage of pregnancy, with her history, we need to be cautious." "Her history?" Blake echoed, looking between the doctor and Sarah. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. "I told Dr. Reynolds about my previous miscarriage." The doctor made some notes on her tablet. "I'll check in again before my shift ends, but for now, try to rest. And Ms. Collins, I mean what I said. Your body is giving you signals that you need to listen to." After the doctor left, silence fell between them. Blake studied Sarah's face, noting the dark circles beneath her eyes, the tension in her jaw. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. "You can't keep working at Elevate," he finally said. Sarah's eyes snapped open. "I don't have a choice, Blake. I have bills to pay, a baby to prepare for. Let me help," he pleaded. "At least financially. I can ensure you don't have to worry about money while you focus on staying healthy." "I don't want your money." It's not about what you want," Blake countered, frustration edging into his voice. "It's about what's best for our child." Sarah looked away. "You don't get to swoop in now and decide what's best. Where were you when I needed you before?" The question hung between them, heavy with years of hurt and disappointment. Blake had no defense, no justification that would erase his past failures. "I wasn't there," he admitted quietly, "and I will regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, Sarah, and I want to be here for both of you." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Why? Because you feel obligated? Because your conscience won't let you walk away again?" "Because this is my child too," Blake said, leaning forward, "and because I never stopped caring about you." The monitors beeped steadily in the background as Sarah absorbed his words. Finally, she sighed. "I'm too tired to argue about this now. We can talk tomorrow." Blake nodded, recognizing the dismissal but unwilling to leave. "I'll stay until you fall asleep." "You don't have to do that." "I know," he replied simply. "But I want to." To his surprise, Sarah didn't protest further. Within minutes, her breathing deepened as exhaustion claimed her. Blake remained in the chair, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the monitor tracking their baby's heartbeat, feeling something shift fundamentally within him. The next morning, Blake awakened to sunlight streaming through the hospital window, and a crick in his neck from sleeping in the chair. Sarah was already awake, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You stayed all night," she observed. Blake straightened, wincing as his stiff muscles protested. "I told you I would." Before Sarah could respond, a nurse entered with discharge papers and instructions. Blake listened attentively as the nurse emphasized the need for rest, proper nutrition, and avoiding stress. He mentally catalogued each recommendation, already formulating a plan. When they were alone again, Blake cleared his throat. "Let me drive you home, please." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." The drive to Sarah's apartment in Dorchester was quiet. Blake tried not to react when he saw the rundown building where she lived, so different from the luxury they had once shared. He walked her up 3 flights of stairs, noting how she had to pause twice to catch her breath. Sarah's apartment was small but meticulously clean. What it lacked in space and luxury, she had compensated for with carefully chosen details: plants on the windowsill, colorful throw pillows on the second-hand sofa, and a bookshelf filled with beloved titles. In one corner, a small bassinet waited for its future occupant, a hand-knitted blanket draped over the side. The sight of that tiny bed brought home the reality of their situation in a way nothing else had. Blake stood transfixed, imagining their child sleeping there, growing there, living a life that had begun without his knowledge or participation. "Tea?" Sarah offered, breaking his reverie. "Let me make it," Blake insisted, moving toward the kitchenette. "You should be resting." 2. His surprise, Sarah didn't argue. She sank onto the sofa, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. Blake busied himself finding cups and tea bags, hyper-aware of her presence just a few feet away. As he waited for the water to boil, he glanced around the apartment again, noting the absence of an elevator, the distance to the nearest grocery store, the stack of medical bills on the counter that Sarah had tried to hide beneath a magazine. "How long do you have left on your lease?" he asked casually, pouring the hot water into mugs. Sarah narrowed her eyes, immediately suspicious. 6 months. Why? Blake brought her the tea and sat in the armchair opposite the sofa. "This building isn't ideal for a baby. No elevator, thin walls, questionable security. Not everyone can afford a harbor view penthouse, Blake." "I have a property in Back Bay," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "A brownstone, 3 bedrooms, garden level, quiet street. It's currently between tenants." Sarah's expression hardened. "I'm not taking your charity." "It's not charity, it's a practical solution." Blake leaned forward. "The doctor said you need rest, that you need to avoid stress. How restful is it going to be climbing these stairs every day? How stress-free will I feel worrying about making rent while you're on maternity leave? I've managed on my own so far." "And you ended up in the hospital," Blake pointed out, immediately regretting his bluntness when hurt flashed across Sarah's face. He softened his tone. "Look, think of it as temporary. Just until after the baby is born, then if you want to move back here, I won't argue." Sarah took a sip of her tea, buying time. "And what do you get out of this arrangement?" The question caught Blake off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's your angle? What do you want in return?" The suspicion in her voice stung, but Blake couldn't blame her. He'd given her plenty of reasons to doubt his motives in the past. "The peace of mind of knowing you and our child are safe and comfortable," he answered honestly. "And the chance to be involved, Sarah. To be part of this baby's life, from the beginning." Sarah's hand moved to her belly again, a gesture Blake was beginning to recognize as both protective and instinctive. "And what happens when you get bored? When the novelty wears off and you realize that babies aren't compatible with your lifestyle?" The question cut deep, not least because Blake had asked himself the same thing during his sleepless night at the hospital. What kind of father would he be? What if he failed this child the way he had failed Sarah? "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what kind of father I'll be. But I want to try, Sarah. I want the chance to be better than I was before." The vulnerability in his admission seemed to reach her. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Let me think about it," she finally said. Blake nodded, recognizing that this was as much of a concession as he could hope for at the moment. Fair enough. As he prepared to leave, giving Sarah the space she needed, Blake paused at the door. "Sarah, thank you for not cutting me out completely. I know you could have, and no one would have blamed you." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I didn't tell you about the pregnancy because I needed to prove to myself that I could do this alone, that I wasn't the same dependent person who fell apart when you left, but now, Blake prompted when she trailed off. Sarah placed her hand on her belly, and the ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Now I realize that this isn't just about me or about you. It's about giving our child the best possible start, whatever that looks like." Blake felt something unfurl in his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "One day at a time." As he walked down the stairs of Sarah's building, his phone vibrated with an incoming call. Vanessa's name flashed on the screen. For a moment, Blake stared at it, realizing with startling clarity that the life he had been building with Vanessa suddenly felt hollow, like a beautiful but empty shell compared to the messy, complicated reality he had just left. He declined the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. There would be time to deal with Vanessa later. Right now, there were more important things to focus on. A week after Sarah's hospital scare, Blake stood in the living room of his Back Bay brownstone, surveying the changes he'd made. The once minimalist space now featured comfortable furniture, warm lighting, and even a few potted plants to soften the modern edges. He'd converted the third bedroom into a nursery, hiring a designer to create a gender-neutral space filled with soft colors and natural materials. The faint smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air. Blake checked his watch. Sarah would arrive in an hour for the tour he'd promised. After days of gentle persuasion and one more warning from her doctor about rest, she had reluctantly agreed to at least look at the brownstone. His phone rang, Michael's name flashing on the screen. "The Hamilton investors are getting anxious," Michael said without preamble when Blake answered. "They expected you to be more hands-on with this project. The VP called me twice yesterday asking where you've been." Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, I've been distracted." "Distracted is putting it mildly. You've missed 3 meetings this week alone. This isn't like you, Blake." "I'll call Hamilton today," Blake promised. "Set up a dinner, smooth things over." "It's more than that," Michael continued, his voice careful. "The word around town is that you and Vanessa had a falling out, and now you're renovating your investment." property instead of finalizing the biggest deal of your career. People are starting to talk. Blake moved to the window, watching as fall leaves danced across the quiet street. A young couple walked by, pushing a stroller, looking tired but content. The sight stirred something in him that he couldn't quite name. "Let them talk," he said finally. "Some things are more important." There was a long silence on the other end. "You're serious about this, aren't you? About Sarah and the baby?" "Yes," Blake answered, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I am." After ending the call, Blake took one more walk through the brownstone, making mental notes of final touches needed. In the nursery, he paused by the window seat, imagining Sarah sitting there cradling their child. The image filled him with a longing so intense it was almost painful. His reverie was interrupted by the doorbell. Sarah was early. When he opened the door, however, it wasn't Sarah who stood on his doorstep, but Vanessa, looking flawless in a designer coat, her expression a perfect mask of controlled fury. "So, this is where you've been hiding," she said, brushing past him into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "Ignoring my calls, cancelling our plans. I had to hear from Caroline Matthews that you pulled out of the Beacon Hill property we were looking at." Blake closed the door slowly. "I should have called you directly. I'm sorry." Vanessa's gaze swept the renovated space, taking in the changes. "What is all this? Since when do you like houseplants?" Her eyes narrowed as understanding dawned. "You're doing this for her, aren't you? Creating some perfect little domestic nest." "Vanessa, don't," she cut him off, raising a manicured hand. "Don't you dare patronize me, Blake. 8 months we've been together. 8 months of me supporting your career, introducing you to the right people, being the perfect partner. And you throw it all away for what? A woman who couldn't handle your lifestyle the first time around." Blake kept his voice level. "I'm sorry if I hurt you, that wasn't my intention. But Sarah is having my child, and I need to be there for them." "Your child?" Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Are you certain about that? Has she offered any proof beyond her word? Women like her see men like you as meal tickets, Blake. Surely you're not that naive." "I think you should leave," Blake said quietly. "Sarah will be here soon and I don't want a scene." Vanessa's eyes flashed. "Oh, I have no intention of causing a scene. I simply wanted to see for myself what was worth throwing away everything. We built together." She moved toward the door but paused with her hand on the knob. "You know, she won't fit into your world any better. This time around. Eventually you'll remember why things didn't work out the first time." After Vanessa left, Blake stood in the silence of the brownstone, her words echoing uncomfortably in his mind. Was he being naive? Was he romanticizing a relationship that had failed once before? The doorbell rang again, interrupting his thoughts. This time it was Sarah who stood on the doorstep, bundled against the October chill, her cheeks flushed, with cold and perhaps a bit of nervousness. "Hi," she said, offering a small smile. "Hi," Blake replied, stepping back to let her in. "Thank you for coming." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the transformed space. "This is, not what I expected." Blake watched her as she moved through the living room, trailing her fingers over the soft throw blankets, examining the bookshelves he'd filled with titles he remembered she loved. "It's nice," she admitted, turning to face him. "Really nice, but Blake, I can't afford a place like this, even with your help." "You wouldn't have to pay rent," he explained. "This is an investment property. It was sitting empty anyway." Sarah frowned. "That's exactly what I mean. It's too much. I can't accept this kind of generosity." "Even for the baby's sake?" Blake asked quietly. Sarah's hand moved to her belly, a gesture that had become familiar. "Let me see the rest of it before I decide." Blake showed her through the brownstone, the modern kitchen with its island seating, the master bedroom with its ensuite bathroom, the second bedroom that could serve as a guest room or office. He saved the nursery for last, watching Sarah's face carefully as he opened the door. The reaction was immediate. Her eyes filled with tears as she took in the carefully designed space, the natural wood crib, the comfortable rocking chair, the wall painted with a gentle mural of trees and woodland creatures. "You did all this?" she whispered. Blake nodded. I had help with the design, but yes, I wanted it to be special. Sarah moved to the window seat, running her hand along the cushions. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the small garden visible through the window. "Why are you doing this, Blake?" "Really?" she asked without looking at him. Blake leaned against the doorframe, considering his answer carefully. "Because I want to be part of our child's life, and because I think I've been given a second chance to get things right. With both of you." Sarah finally turned to face him. "I'm not the same person I was when we were married. I don't need you to take care of me. I don't need to be rescued." "I know that," Blake replied. "You're stronger now, more independent. I can see it, and I admire it." He hesitated, then added, "But that doesn't mean you have to do everything alone." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful. "I'll think about it," she finally said. "But if, and it's a big if, I agree to move in here, it would have to be temporary, and we would need clear boundaries." Blake felt a surge of hope. "Of course, whatever you're comfortable with." As he walked her back to the front door, Sarah paused. "I saw Vanessa leaving as I was arriving," she said quietly. "She seemed upset." Blake winced. We're not together anymore." "Because of me?" Sarah asked, her expression troubled. "Because of the baby?" "Because I realized what was truly important," Blake answered honestly. "And it wasn't what I thought it was." After Sarah left, promising to call him with her decision in a few days, Blake returned to the nursery. Standing alone in the quiet room, he was struck by how much had changed in such a short time. Just weeks ago, his priorities had been so different: career advancement, wealth accumulation, maintaining his carefully curated social position. Now, all of that seemed hollow compared to the prospect of being a father, of rebuilding some kind of relationship with Sarah. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. 3 days later, Blake sat in his office half-heartedly reviewing plans for the Hamilton project. His concentration was broken by a text message alert. "Sarah, I've thought about your offer. If you're still willing, I'd like to accept, temporarily." Blake's heartbeat quickened as he read the message twice, then replied, "Blake, the offer stands." "When would you like to move in?" "Sarah, this weekend. My doctor wants me to start my maternity leave early and I could use the help with moving." "Blake, I'll arrange everything. Just tell me what you need." Sarah, "Thank you, and Blake, this doesn't mean we're getting back together. I'm doing this for the baby." Blake stared at the last message, feeling a complicated mix of emotions: hope, disappointment, determination. "Blake, I understand. I'll be there Saturday morning." That weekend, as Blake helped Sarah settle into the brownstone, he was careful to respect the boundaries she had set. He carried boxes, assembled furniture, and arranged her belongings according to her instructions, all without pushing for more than she was willing to give. By Sunday evening, Sarah was installed in the master bedroom. Despite Blake's insistence that she should have it, she had insisted they flip a coin. Her books filled one of the shelves in the living room, and her favorite coffee mug had found a home in the kitchen cabinet. As they shared a takeout dinner at the kitchen island, maintaining the careful distance that had characterized their interactions, Sarah suddenly winced, her hand flying to her side. "What is it?" Blake asked, immediately concerned. "Should we call the doctor?" Sarah shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "There's nothing. The baby's just kicking. Really hard tonight." Before he could stop himself, Blake asked, "Can I? Would it be okay if I felt it?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Come here." Blake moved around the island, his heart pounding as Sarah took his hand and placed it on the curve of her belly. For a moment nothing happened, and then there it was, a definite push against his palm, strong and insistent. "Oh my God," he breathed, eyes wide with wonder. That's our baby." "Active tonight," Sarah confirmed, something softening in her expression as she watched Blake's reaction. "The doctor says that's a good sign, strong and healthy." Blake couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the reality of that small life beneath his hand, their child. a miracle he'd almost missed entirely. "Thank you," he managed finally, reluctantly withdrawing his hand, "for letting me be part of this." Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time since they'd reconnected, there was no anger or wariness in her eyes, only a cautious warmth. "You're welcome." Later that night, as Blake lay in his bed listening to the occasional sounds of Sarah moving around in her room across the hall, he made a silent promise to both her and their unborn child. He would be patient. He would be present. He would be the man they needed him to be, not the man he had been. And maybe, just maybe, he would earn back what he had so carelessly thrown away. The weeks that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Blake worked from home as much as possible, converting the second bedroom into a makeshift office. Sarah spent her days resting, preparing for the baby, and occasionally consulting with Elevate about special events they wanted her expertise on, though she remained firm about not returning to work before her maternity leave was over. Their coexistence was cautious but increasingly comfortable. They shared meals, watched movies in the evening, and gradually rediscovered pieces of each other they had forgotten. Sarah's dry sense of humor, Blake's unexpected knowledge of classic literature, the way they could complete each other's sentences when discussing topics they both cared about. One evening in early December, as snow fell gently outside the brownstone windows, Blake returned home to find Sarah in the nursery, struggling to assemble a mobile for the crib. "Need help?" he offered from the doorway. Sarah looked up, blowing a strand of hair from her face in frustration. "This thing came with instructions that might as well be hieroglyphics," Blake laughed, moving to kneel beside her. "Let me see." Working together, they managed to put the mobile together, a delicate arrangement of stars and planets that would rotate above their sleeping child. As Blake hung it over the crib, Sarah stood back to admire their work. "It's perfect," she said softly. Blake turned to find her watching him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "What?" "Nothing, just..." She hesitated. "You're different now." "Different how?" Sarah considered the question. "More present. When we were married, you were always somewhere else, even when you were physically there. Always thinking about the next deal, the next meeting." Blake met her gaze steadily. "I was chasing the wrong things back then. I thought success meant one thing, now I know better." Later that night, as they sat in the living room, the remains of dinner cleared away, and a comfortable silence between them, Sarah suddenly gasped. "What is it?" Blake asked, immediately alert. "Nothing's wrong," Sarah assured him, grimacing slightly. "The baby's just doing gymnastics tonight." She shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, trying to find a position that eased the pressure. Without thinking, Blake moved to sit beside her. "May I?" he asked gently. At Sarah's nod, he began to massage her lower back, his fingers finding the knots of tension with careful precision. Sarah sighed in relief, her eyes closing. "Better?" Blake asked. "Much," Sarah murmured. They stayed. That way for several minutes, the only sound the soft music playing from the speakers and the occasional contented sigh from Sarah. Blake was acutely aware of her closeness, of the scent of her shampoo, of how perfectly she still fit against him. "I've been thinking," Sarah said finally, her voice quiet in the dimly lit room. "About us. About what happened." Blake's hands stilled. "What about it?" Sarah turned slightly to face him. "I blamed you for everything that went wrong. For the miscarriage, for our marriage falling apart. And you deserved a lot of that blame." She paused. "But not all of it." Blake waited, sensing there was more. "I could have fought harder," Sarah continued. "I could have told you how desperately unhappy I was instead of expecting you to just know. I could have insisted that you come to therapy with me instead of giving up when you said no the first time." "Sarah, let me finish," she said gently. "I'm not saying what you did was okay. It wasn't. But marriages don't fail because of just one person. And I've had to accept my part in ours ending." Blake took her hand, a tentative gesture that she didn't pull away from. "I was a workaholic who put my career above everything else, above you. I'll never forgive myself for not being there when you lost our first baby." Sarah's eyes glistened, with unshed tears, We both lost that baby, Blake, and we both lost each other. The moment stretched between them, heavy with words unsaid. Then Sarah sighed and squeezed his hand. It's getting late. I should get to bed. Blake helped her to her feet, reluctantly letting go of her hand. Good night, Sarah. She hesitated at the base of the stairs, then turned back. Blake, thank you for everything you've done these past few weeks. You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what I should have done a long time ago. The next morning, Blake was in his home office on a conference call when he heard a crash from the kitchen, followed by Sarah calling his name. He ended the call mid-sentence and rushed downstairs to find Sarah leaning against the counter, a shattered glass at her feet and a puddle of water spreading across the floor. My water broke, she said, her voice tight with pain. The baby's coming. Blake's heart lurched into his throat. Now? But it's 3 weeks early. Tell that to the baby, Sarah grimaced, clutching her belly as a contraction hit. We need to go to the hospital, now. Blake went into action mode, grabbing the hospital bag Sarah had prepared, helping her into a coat, and guiding her to the car with careful urgency. The drive to Massachusetts General Hospital passed in a blur of red lights, shortcuts through back streets, and Sarah's increasingly frequent contractions. By the time they reached the maternity ward, Sarah was fully in labor, her face flushed with exertion and pain. The nurse took one look at her and called for a wheelchair. First baby? She asked as she helped Sarah into the chair. Sarah nodded, unable to speak, as another contraction hit. She reached blindly for Blake's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. I'm right here, he assured her. I'm not going anywhere. The next hours were a chaotic mix of pain, medical procedures, and overwhelming emotion. Blake remained at Sarah's side, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, letting her squeeze his hand until his fingers went numb, and offering encouragement when she felt she couldn't go on. You're doing amazing, he told her as she struggled through another contraction. You're the strongest person I've ever known. Sarah laughed weakly. Flatter me later. Right now I just want this baby out. Dr. Reynolds checked Sarah's progress again. Almost there, Sarah. A few more pushes should do it. Blake moved closer, supporting Sarah's shoulders as she braced herself for the final effort. You can do this, he whispered. We're so close to meeting our baby. With a cry that seemed to come from her very soul, Sarah gave one final push. There was a moment of suspended time, a collective breath held, and then the room filled with the indignant wail of their newborn child. It's a girl, Dr. Reynolds announced, placing the squirming, slippery infant on Sarah's chest. A beautiful, healthy baby girl. Sarah's tears flowed freely as she cradled their daughter, her fingers tracing the perfect features of the tiny face. Hello, little one, she whispered. We've been waiting for you. Blake couldn't speak, overcome by a wave of love so powerful it left him breathless. He reached out with trembling fingers to touch his daughter's hand, marveling when her impossibly small fingers curled around his thumb. She knows her daddy, the nurse said, smiling at Blake's awestruck expression. Daddy. The word resonated through him like a bell, clear and true. He was a father. This tiny, perfect being was his daughter. Would you like to hold her? Sarah asked softly, looking up at Blake with an expression he hadn't seen in years, trust complete and unguarded. Carefully, as if handling the most precious object in the world, Blake took his daughter from Sarah's arms. The baby squirmed, then settled against his chest, her eyes so like Sarah's, blinking up at him curiously. Hello, sweetheart, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I'm your dad, and I promise I will never ever let you down. Looking up, he found Sarah watching them, tears streaming down her cheeks. She needs a name, she said. Blake nodded, returning to Sarah's side, their daughter held securely between them. Any ideas? Sarah smiled, a soft, tired, beautiful smile. What about Emma? Emma Grace Richardson. Emma, Blake repeated, testing the name. It fit. It's perfect. She's perfect. Later, as Sarah slept in the hospital bed, Blake sat in the chair beside her, their daughter cradled in his arms. He couldn't stop staring at her, memorizing every detail of her face, the rise and fall of her tiny chest, the way her lips pursed in sleep. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening slowly. "You're still here," she murmured. "I told you I wasn't going." "Anywhere," Blake replied. "I meant it." Sarah's gaze moved to their sleeping daughter and her face softened with love. "She's amazing, isn't she? Just like her mother." Sarah studied Blake's face for a long moment. "You know, when I first saw you at Elevate, I was terrified that you would ruin everything, that you would make promises you couldn't keep, that you would break my heart all over again." "And now?" Blake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now I think I want to believe in second chances." Sarah reached for his hand, and Blake took it, feeling the warmth of her touch like a lifeline. "I'm not saying everything is fixed between us. We have a lot of history, a lot of hurt to work through. But," Sarah smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, "but I love you, Blake Richardson. I never stopped, not really. And I want to try again for Emma's sake, for our sake." Blake felt his heart swell with a joy he had never known possible. "I love you too, Sarah. I always have, and I swear to you I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving it." He leaned forward, carefully holding Emma with one arm while his free hand cupped Sarah's cheek. For the first time in years, their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their new beginning. 6 months later, on a perfect spring day, Blake stood in the garden of the Back Bay brownstone, watching as Sarah placed Emma on a blanket beneath the shade of a flowering cherry tree. Emma, now plump and inquisitive, immediately rolled onto her stomach and pushed up on her arms, looking around with bright, curious eyes. "She's going to be crawling any day now," Sarah predicted, settling beside their daughter. "Then we're really in trouble." Blake laughed, joining them on the blanket. "I've already baby-proofed every inch of the house, twice." Sarah leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Remember when I said moving in here was temporary?" "I remember," Blake replied, his arm sliding around her waist. "I think I've changed my mind," Sarah said, looking up at him with a smile. "This feels like home now. The three of us, together." Blake's heart filled with contentment as he looked at his family, his wife and daughter bathed in dappled sunlight, safe and happy. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, the mistakes and misunderstandings, the hurt and the healing. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a ring. Not the ostentatious diamond he had given her the first time, but a simple, elegant band set with a sapphire the color of Sarah's eyes. "We're already married," Sarah said, confused. "Technically, we're divorced," Blake reminded her with a smile. "And I thought maybe we could change that, start fresh, do it right this time." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked from the ring to Blake's face. "Are you asking me to marry you? Again?" Blake took her hand. "Sarah Collins, mother of my child, love of my life, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Again?" Sarah laughed through her tears. "Yes, of course, yes." As Blake slipped the ring onto her finger, Emma let out a happy gurgle as if giving her approval. Sarah leaned forward to kiss Blake, a kiss that held all the wisdom of their past and all the promise of their future. Later that evening, as Emma slept peacefully in her nursery, and Sarah and Blake stood together by the window, watching the lights of Boston twinkle in the distance, Blake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Once he had thought success meant building the tallest buildings, closing the biggest deals, accumulating the most wealth. Now he knew better. Success was this: the soft sound of his daughter's breathing over the baby monitor, the warm weight of Sarah in his arms, the knowledge that every mistake, every wrong turn had somehow led him exactly where he was meant to be. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, looking up at him. Blake smiled, tightening his arms around her. "I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest man in the world." Sarah returned his smile, her eyes reflecting all the love in her heart. "We both got lucky. We found our way back to each other. And we're never letting go again," Blake promised, sealing his words with a kiss. In the nursery, Emma slept on, safe in the knowledge, even before she had words to express it, that she was surrounded by love. And in the quiet of their home, Blake and Sarah began the next chapter of their story, not as the people they had once been, but as the people they had become, stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever the future held, together. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Emma's journey touched your heart and reminded you of the power of second chances. Sometimes life brings us full circle, showing us that what we thought we lost might be exactly what we need to find again. For more stories that explore love, redemption, and the beautiful complexity of human relationships, we've created a special playlist you can find by clicking to your left. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you new narratives that explore the depths of the human experience. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. What was your favorite moment in Blake and Sarah's journey? Your engagement helps us continue to create these meaningful stories. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we never thought we'd say. I'm sorry, I forgive you, and I want to try again.